D3 provides you with different types of scale when you want to convert numbers to numbers, but it also provides you with scales when you want to convert categorical value to numbers. And those types of scales is what we call ordinal scales. And the way it works is basically you want to map a value in the original space to a value on the graphic space. So one thing is important here is that it doesn't have to be a number on the graphic space. So for example, you can use ordinal scales also to map to color. So if you want to associate a different color to each name that you have in your data set, you can also use ordinal scales. And but the idea here is exactly that. So the values that are gonna come as input are categorical values, are values that it can be strings, it can also be numbers, but they don't have a specific order or a specific range. So therefore, when we create this scale ordinal, we're going to still using the same thing that we had before. We create the scale, and here we are creating one that's called scale ordinal, and then we call our domain. The difference here is that domain is not going to be a range anymore. It's going to be a list of values. It's all the values that I can assume on this scale. And then we're going to have the range, and the range specifically for the scale ordinal is going to be the list of values that I'm going to assume on my graphical space. So for example, imagine that I want to map the colors. I'm going to have the list of names on my domain, and then I'm going to have the list of colors on my range. So for example, here we are creating a scale where we want to map A, B, and C. Think of that as grades, for example, and we want to map those to actual numbers. So we can, for example, change the intensity or the size of things on our graphic space. So what we are doing is mapping A to 10, B to 8, and C to 6. So later, if I call my scale and pass as parameter the letter A, I'm going to get 10. And the same thing is going to happen if I pass my letter C, I'm going to get 6. And you can add as many items you need in your list, but you always have this one-to-one map between what you put in the domain and what you get on your as output of your scale. There is other options of ordinal scales, and one of such is what we call scale band. And different from ordinal scale that maps the values to a number, here we are mapping the values to a band. So think about a range. So for example, here I have 100, and I have 3 people. So now I basically split this 100 in 3 pieces, and each of those pieces are my bands. And now I'm going to map each name to one of those bands. What's the difference of mapping to a number? The difference is that first, instead of getting some number in the middle, if I give the number to the scale, I'm going to actually get the start of the band, where the band begins. The second thing is that now we have information about the band width. That is, how tall, in this case, would be each of those pieces. And this is very helpful if you're drawing a bar chart, for example, because you can use this scale to decide the width of your bar such that your bar can adjust to the number of elements that you have. So if you have many elements, your bars are going to be thinner, or if you have less elements, your bar is going to be a little thicker, so you can use more of the space that you have. And how we use the scale band? So similar to the scale ordinal, we're going to do dot scale band to create the scale. Then we're going to call dot domain. And then domain here, same thing, is going to be the list of values that we can have in our data. Then we're going to call range. So range is different because range is going to be similar to a numeric scale. We want a range of values, the minimum and the maximum. And again, it can be 0 to 300 to 400. So if I'm doing a bar chart, for example, it's going to be the width of the places where I can put my bars. So if my chart has 300 pixels, it would be from 0 to 300 pixels. So here we have the same example. So note that we have the same domain. We have scale band. The domain is the same, but now we change the range. So the range is a number from 0 to 300. So what the system is going to do is basically take this 300 and split in chunks of 100 pixels each. So you basically divide it by 3 because this is the number of elements that we have in our domain. So once I have those chunks, if I call this function, what I get is the beginning of the chunk. So note that the beginning of the chunk A is going to be 0. The beginning of the chunk B is going to be 100 because that is where the first chunk ends. So it's not like a numerical scale that you would think if it's in the middle, it's going to be 150 because it's half. No, that's the beginning of the chunk. So the same thing if I run to C, I'm going to get 200, because then plus the width, I'm going to get the 300 space that I have available. And if I want to get the width, I can just use scale.bandwidth to get what's the size of each band. So keep in mind that we can use ordinal scales to map values that are mostly categorical or even ordinal, but they are not really numerical. You don't do arithmetic functions with them, to information on the graphic space that can be a number, but can also be a categorical value like colors or any type of information that you may use in your visualization. So if we are dealing with data that in the original format has numeric shape, most of the time we're going to be using numeric scale. But if we are dealing with data that are categorical or ordinal shape, then most of the time you're going to be working with ordinal scales.